Welcome to the Marley Bird YouTube channel, brought to you by Red Heart Yarns. In this video, I will show you how to make this fantastic brioche scarf. This scarf uses 1 ball of Red Heart Soft Essentials in a solid color and 3 balls in Red Heart Soft Essentials in a stripes. That's what gives you the really great striped look coupled with the brioche, and the solid color is used down here at the bottom ribbing to get 2-color brioche ribbing. The brioche scarf is rather simple, but because it is an experienced pattern, I have broken it up into a 3-part video series. In part 1, you will learn how to cast on and work in 2-color brioche ribbing. In part 2, you will learn how to do brioche knit stitch for the body of the scarf. In part 3, you will learn how to transition back to the 2-color brioche ribbing and how to bind off in pattern. This is a really wonderful pattern, and honestly, if you know how to knit, how to purl, and how to yarn over, you can accomplish the brioche stitch. It really isn't too hard. It will require just a little bit of patience and a little bit of understanding and slowing down, but that's what I'm here for, and that's why you have Rewind right here on the Marley Bird YouTube channel, right? This is a free pattern available over on the Red Heart website. I will put a link to the pattern and all the materials on my blog post, so you can find that direct link in that little I button right up there or in the video description box right down there below. While you're down there, please go ahead and smash that like button, as my kids say, to let people know you enjoyed this video or that you plan on making this scarf. I would love to know that. Now what I would like you to do is go ahead and download that free pattern, gather your materials, and join me back here. I'm going to get you started with understanding the basics of the brioche stitch. Brioche knitting is very similar to knit one, purl one ribbing. It's sort of like a combination of knit one, purl one ribbing and double knitting. It's sort of a hybrid. You create brioche knitting by working a series of sets of stitches. And a set of stitches is usually a slip one yarn over coupled with the brioche knit, or a slip one yarn over coupled with the brioche purl. Let's take a look at the actual scarf so you can see the difference between a brioche rib and an actual knit one, purl one rib. As you take a look down here, you can see I have over here, still on the needles, a knit one, purl one rib, and you can see that these stitches are really nice and snug together, right? And if I were to separate out the knits and purls, it's very distinguishable between the knit row or the knit column and the purl column, correct? And when I release, everything really springs back into shape. When I look over here at the brioche rib, you can see it automatically, it already looks like it's a little bit more relaxed. And there's a little bit more give to the stitches, correct? And as I space out these stitches, not only do you see this column of knit stitches, but in the column of purl stitches, you get this diagonal looking stitch right next to the purl. And that diagonal is created by doing the yarn overs with the slip one that you do when you create the brioche. Down here at the bottom part of this scarf, this is 2-color brioche ribbing. You can see here that we have the nice dark charcoal color that really shows up in the knit columns. But when I space this out, you begin to see the linen stitch colorway from the Soft Essentials stripes that shows up in the gutter. And if I were to flip this over, you can see the linen stitch stripes really shows up on the knit columns on the reverse side. This is 2-color brioche knitting in the rib pattern, okay? So we will begin with this. That's where you will use your solid color coupled with your stripes color. That's what you will learn in this particular video. We will learn to cast on, and we will learn how to do 2-color brioche rib. When you're working in brioche, the stitches tend to stretch out a little bit more than a typical knit one, purl one rib, obviously. It is recommended when you're working brioche that you use a needle size that is 1 to 2 sizes smaller than the size you would typically use for that yarn. So for this particular pattern, the designer has you using a size 9 knitting needle, which is a 5.5 millimeter, and she wants you to use a circular knitting needle. Now, having said that, I know most of you are going to be like, well, can I use straights? The answer is no. We are using circular knitting needles because when we work this ribbing part, this 2-color brioche ribbing, we will actually be moving the stitches down to the opposite end of our needle, and we need to be able to have access to both ends of our knitting. So that's where the circular needle is really going to come in handy. If you are adamant that you want to use straight needles, the closest you could get is using some straight double pointed needles. So that way you can move the stitches down to the opposite end of the double pointed needle. But honestly, the best thing to do is just to get some circular needles and use them for this pattern. The other thing I want to point out is in typical brioche patterns, you will have a row gauge and a stitch gauge that is given as if 2 rows are worked into one. That is because it takes 2 rows, 2 passes to create one brioche row. So typically when you are given a gauge, you will be given, let's say 16 rows equals 4 inches. And that 16 rows is actually a total of 32 rows because it takes 2 rows to complete one. The reason I am taking the time to point this out now is because in the pattern, the Fantastic Brioche Scarf pattern, the designer actually wrote the row gauge to be given as if you were working each row individually, not as if a typical brioche pattern is you work 2 rows to complete one. For this pattern, she has each one written individually. So her row gauge is 32 rows equals 4 inches, when a typical brioche pattern would actually have that written down as 16 rows equals 4 inches. The difference here is this, and I want you to look at the scarf down here. When I put my tape measure or my knit check on my project to begin to count my rows, I can set this on here, and what's going to show up here are my actual knit rows right here, correct? And I could count. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 8 knit rows. The difference here is that with the way the gauge is written in the pattern, those 8 rows would actually be counted as 16 rows. Even though I'm only looking at 8 knits, it would be counted as 16 rows. It sounds confusing, right? That's the reason I want to make sure I point this out. As you become more advanced in your brioche career or you venture out to do other brioche patterns, I don't want you to get confused. I don't want you to say, okay, well, man, I'm getting 8 rows to 2 inches and I should be getting 16 based on the pattern. The thing is, we are getting the 16 based on the pattern because the pattern is counting each pass as a particular row, when a typical brioche pattern counts 2 passes as 1 row. And the reason is because the 2 passes as 1 row leaves us with the 1 knit that we are now able to count here as the 8 rows for our 2 inches. I know that seems a little bit confusing, and I apologize for that, but it is important that I point it out because the pattern is written in such a way that it might not be written for other brioche patterns, and I want to make sure you're aware of that. So that way when you do your gauge swatch or as you are working on your scarf pattern, you know how to count your stitches. So what I have done, because I'm always so helpful, you guys, is I have done a line by line writing of the pattern, and it's available on my blog. Again, you can find a direct link to that right down there in the video description box below, or I'll put a link right up there in that little I button. And what I've done here, let's take a look as we look down here, is I have put in some standard brioche terms. I've added some notes, and then I have the pattern rewritten in such a way that you would find it in other brioche patterns, and I have the pattern written as it is written in the actual pattern, just in long format, meaning you will have each particular row repeated for you, and it will help you divide up and know how many rows you need to do in order to accomplish the scarf. So what you need to do is go ahead, get this information as well, and again, it's on my blog, and you can follow along either with the rewritten terms or with the pattern as written, and it's just line by line, The full entire pattern is there, and you can decide which way you want to go. And it will also help you to understand how this pattern differs from other brioche patterns and help you become more fluent in brioche knitting. How about that? All right, so those are the big things that I want to make sure I point out here at the start. So what I need you to make sure you've done is your pattern, your line by line instructions, your materials, and let's go ahead and jump in. We are going to cast on using the long tail cast on. Let's jump in and create this really great scarf. The instructions want you to cast on 32 stitches, and if you want to change the size of your scarf, all you need to do is make sure you cast on an even number of stitches. I am going to use the long tail cast on to do my cast on stitches, and I want to make sure my stitches are nice and loosely cast on. As far as how loose do you cast them on, you want to make sure that the stitches can move easily on the needle, and that if you were to put your needle upside down, they aren't going to fall off. That's about a good judge of character. Let's see, 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. The reason you want to make sure you have your stitches nice and loose is because the nature of the brioche stitch is to get rather wide. And if you don't do your cast on stitches loosely, it will tend to bunch in at the bottom, and the same goes when you do the bind off. Now I've decided just to do a basic even number of stitches here, and you, if you're following along with the scarf, make sure you do your 32 stitches. Once you get those stitches cast on, you're going to go ahead and turn your work. Now, I want to point out that I have cast on with my color A, and color A is simply the solid color that is used here in the 2-color brioche ribbing part of the scarf. Color B is what you will use for the body of the scarf. So think of B for body. So color A is not your dominant color, okay? We're still on color A, and what we will do is jump in to our setup row. Now what happened here is we have cast on stitches, but because we're going to work in brioche, we have to set up our brioche pattern. And when you work in brioche, it takes 2 rows to complete 1 row. It takes 2 passes. Think of it this way. In our first pass, we will be doing slip stitches and our regular brioche stitch. And in our second pass back, we want to work our brioche stitch into the stitches that we slipped. So that way all of our stitches are worked completely. In order to work all of those stitches completely, it requires 2 rows. Now that's important to point out because on most brioche patterns, you will find that the rows are written as 1A or 1B, or 2A or 2B. Whereas this particular pattern has each row written out individually and in sequence. So it says row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I just want to make sure I point that out so when you move on and do other brioche projects and you find the instructions are different than the way this one is written, you can understand why. So here we go. We're moving into the setup row 1, and it begins with a knit 1. We will do this entire scarf beginning with a knit stitch and ending with a knit stitch the whole way. So if you want to do a stitch marker after this first stitch or before the last stitch to remind you of that, you could absolutely do that. Once you do that knit 1, you'll see in the instructions it has a bracket and it tells you to go ahead and knit the next stitch, and then it tells you to do a yarn over slip 1. I'm going to refer to that yarn over slip 1 as a slip 1 yarn over, and it is the same motion throughout the entire pattern. Whether you're doing the setup rows or the body of the pattern, it's a slip 1 yarn over, and here's how you're going to do it. Are you ready? You want to bring your yarn to the front of your needles, go into the next stitch as if to purl, slip that stitch off and bring the yarn back to the back of the needle, just resting on top of that needle. That's it. Now we have finished the bracket, so we start the bracket again. The next stitch is a knit 1. Our yarn is in back, which is what we want, and we go ahead and we knit 1 stitch. Now we have a yarn over slip 1, so we bring our yarn forward, slip 1, and bring our yarn back to the back. Then we knit the next stitch. We do our yarn over slip 1, which is also a slip 1 yarn over, and then we knit the next stitch. Bring our yarn forward, go in as if to purl and off, our yarn's back to the back, and we knit the next stitch. I'm going to show you how to do it if you are continental. We are at our yarn over slip 1, or slip 1 yarn over, so I bring my yarn forward, go in as if to purl, and when I slip, I simply bring my yarn back to the back. It is important that I really point out that this is a singular motion. This is 1 stitch. This is a pair that will always be together. That slip stitch and the yarn over will always be together. That's what creates the brioche stitch, okay? This is a single stitch. That's why in my written instructions that I mentioned, you will actually find it written as a SL1 yo, a slip 1 yo, okay? So now that I've done my slip 1 yarn over, I will knit 1 stitch, bring my yarn forward, go in as if to purl, slip it off, bring my yarn back to the back, and then knit 1, do that 1 more time. And remember I said you will knit the last stitch now and throughout. I've just completed the first setup row, and I need to do the second setup row because I have slip stitches in there, right? We need to work those. But because we're doing a 2-color brioche ribbing, this is where I will bring in my color B, B for body, and I will work the next row with my color B. Here's why you need circular needles. You need to be able to take all of these stitches, move them down to the end of the needle, so that way when we join color B, we are actually joining color B into the very first stitch we created. So that's why I need the circulars. I need to be able to have access to this end of the stitches. Okay, let's go ahead and spread these out and take a look at what you should be looking at. In your work, it should look something like this, where you have a series of singular knits and a series of knits and yarn overs, okay? For setup row 2, you simply grab color B and you will begin working setup row 2 with your new color. So for setup row 2, we begin with a knit 1, just like we did before, because we will do that throughout our entire scarf pattern. And now we will jump in to the brioche stitches. We will bring our yarn forward, and then you'll see the brackets where it says to go ahead and slip 1 with the yarn forward, and then it says to go ahead and yarn over and purl 2 together. Well, remember, we know that our slip 1 and yarn over is 1 motion, okay? So there is our slip 1 yarn over. But now it says to purl 2 together, and you're like, wait a minute, you said that yarn over and that stitch were a pair. They don't count as 2 individual stitches. They are a pair. And that is correct. That's one area where I actually don't agree with the pattern where it says a purl 2 together, because I think it can be confusing. In most patterns, this yarn over and stitch will be referred to as a brioche knit or a brioche purl. And that's what we are going to do. By purling these 2 together, as it's written in the pattern, we are actually going to do a brioche purl. Okay, so you ready? So we did our slip 1 and our yarn over, so that's our slip 1 yarn over, and our yarn is in back. If we want to purl these 2 together or do our brioche purl, we have to bring our yarn between our needles, go into that stitch, that brioche stitch, and purl them together. Does that make sense? So then I would slip the next stitch and make sure I bring my yarn over top and back to the back to get my yarn over. Bring my yarn between my needles back to the front, and then purl these 2 together, which is going to be called a brioche purl. Yarns forward, slip the next stitch, bring our yarn to the back, bring our yarn back to the front between our needles, and do a brioche purl. Slip the next stitch, Bring our yarn back over top of our right hand needle, bring it back between our needles, go into that yarn over and the stitch, and do a brioche purl. Our yarn is forward, slip the next stitch, yarn over top of the right hand needle back to the back, between the needles back to the front, and brioche purl. Let's do that with my yarn in the other hand. Remember, this is not my go-to knitting method, so it might look a little bit iffy, but we can do this together. Are you ready? My yarn is in front, so I will slip the stitch, bring my yarn to the back, and back forward between my needles, and then do my brioche purl, right? That's my purl two together. My yarn is in front, so I go into the stitch as if to purl, slip it off, bring my yarn over top of the needle, back between my needles and forward, and then brioche purl. I'm to my last stitch and I want to knit it, so I bring my yarn between my needles because it's in front, remember? I want to get it back to the back and I will knit my next stitch. Pretty easy, right? And as you look down this row, you'll see that you have a combination of yarn overs and the slip stitch. Okay, so that is our set. And then a single stitch, yarn over, slip stitch, single stitch, yarn over, slip stitch, single stitch. Now that we are at the end of this row, this is the end of our setup row, you now have both colors down here at one end, and it's time to turn. So we will turn our work, and we move on to row 3 as written in the pattern, or if you're following along with my rewrite, we are moving on to row 1A. So I will grab color A, and we will move to row 3 as written in the pattern. So row 3 begins with a knit 1, just like we do all along. And then it jumps into bringing the yarn forward and jumping into our slip 1 yarn over. I want to point out here, because those of you who follow along in the videos know I like to be able to read my knitting. One of the first clues that you have that you are going to be slipping that first stitch is that it is a standalone stitch, right? The stitch that has the yarn over partner is next to it. So we aren't going to do our brioche stitch until we get to that one. So this standalone stitch is going to be our slip stitch. And so in order to do that, we bring our yarn forward, go into the stitch as if to purl, slip it off, bring our yarn back to the back, and we move on to the next step. Now, as we're looking at our yarn over and our stitch here, this is our brioche stitch, correct? We are looking at a purl bump. Can you see that? You see that purl bump? That is your clue that this is going to be a brioche purl. How cool is that? This is our clue that we're going to do a brioche purl. And what's really cool is because we're using two colors, you can easily see where the yarn over and the stitch are together. So there is our partnered pair. So to do a brioche purl, remember our yarn is in back because of our yarn over we just created. We have to have it back to the front to create the purl two together, or the brioche purl. So we go between our needles and we do our brioche purl. Slip 1 yarn over, bring our yarn back to the front, brioche purl. Slip 1 yarn over, bring our yarn back to the front, brioche purl. Get this so far? Slip 1 yarn over, yarn back to the front, brioche purl. Slip 1 yarn over, back to the front, brioche purl. Slip 1 yarn over, back to the front, brioche purl. Slip 1 yarn over, back to the front, brioche purl. And we want to knit our last stitch because we knit the last stitch of the row. So I will knit the last stitch. We've just finished our row 3, which is the first pass. Now we have slip stitches here we have to work into, so we have to do that. And we will do that by moving these stitches to the end of the needle. where our color B is waiting for us, and we will do row 4 with our color B. So here we go. For row 4 and color B, we are introducing a new stitch, and it's really not that big of a deal. It's actually the brioche knit. Now, if the brioche purl is a purl 2 together, what do you think the brioche knit is? That's right, it's the knit 2 together in the brioche. So as it's written in the patterns, let me show you how to do that. We're here at the start, and we will begin with our knit 1 just as always. We automatically can see right here we have our yarn over and our stitch waiting there. And remember, at the start of the last row I pointed out that we only had the stitch there. So this is our first clue that we are going to begin here with a brioche stitch of some sort. Our second clue here is that you can barely see it, but that is a knit stitch. So we know that we're going to do a brioche knit. And we can also tell that our next standalone stitch is a purl. So that gives us another clue that we're going to have a brioche knit here because it's ribbing, right? We're going to have knit, purl, knit, purl. In the instructions, luckily enough, it is already written out for you, so you don't have to worry about reading your knitting, but this is a great way to be able to know where you are if you just pick up your work and you don't have your instructions with you. We start off here on row 4. We did our knit 1, and now it's time to do our knit 2 together, which we are going to call our brioche knit. It's the slip stitch and the yarn over. You literally knit those 2 stitches together, and that's why the pattern is written as a knit 2 together. And we're going to call that a brioche knit. We bring our yarn forward, slip the next stitch as if to purl, bring the yarn back to the back, and then we do our brioche knit. Right? Bring our yarn forward, slip as if to purl, bring our yarn back to the back, and brioche knit. Let me do it with my yarn in my other hand. It's where I'm more comfortable anyways. So you can see how it goes. Bring my yarn forward, slip, bring my yarn back to the back, and then brioche knit. Forward, slip, back to the back, and brioche knit. What's convenient is as you get going, you'll get a really great rhythm with this, where you don't have to really think too much about bringing your yarn forward and then back to the back. It becomes natural. I'm to the end here, and I remember that I knit my last stitch just like normal, and I have now completed my row 4. And now that I'm at the end of row 4 and both of my colors are down here at this end, that is a clue for me to know that it's time to turn my work. So even though the instructions say that I am just completing row 4, in reality, I've only completed 2 brioche rows, okay? I keep reiterating that, I know, but I think it's important to point out so that way as you move on and do other brioche projects, you know how this works. We're moving on to row 5 of the brioche pattern, and we're back to color A. And so we begin with our knit 1. And we automatically jump in here. We can see our yarn over and our stitch right there. So we know we're going to start off with the brioche stitch. And our second clue that it's going to be a brioche knit is that we're looking at knits. Okay, so here we go. We're going to do our brioche knit. Bring our yarn forward, slip 1 and yarn back to the back. So that's our slip 1 yarn over. And then brioche knit. Slip 1 yarn over, brioche knit. Slip 1 yarn over, brioche knit. Slip 1 yarn over, brioche knit, all the way down the row. And you want to remember that as you do your brioche knit, you are knitting together the yarn over and the stitch. It's actually the yarn over and the slip stitch from the previous row. Slip 1 yarn over, and I end with my knit 1. Now that I just finished color A, I need to move my stitches down to the end of my needle, and I will do color B, which will be my row 6 as written in the pattern, and it's row 2B as written in the rewrite, depending on which way you're following. So here we go. On our first one, we will knit this first stitch, and then we automatically jump into row 6. Now, let's read our knitting here. we see a solitary stitch there. That is not our brioche stitch. That's the stitch we're going to slip. So we want to make sure we bring our yarn forward, slip, and go back to the back. Now we're to our brioche stitch, and we can see that we're looking at purls. So we know we're on our brioche purl, which would be our purl two together, correct? So I want to make sure I bring my yarn between my needles back to the front, and then brioche purl. Slip one yarn over, 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 brioche purl. I want to remind you once again, just because I'm here, I might as well. When you do your slip one yarn over, your yarn is in back. You need to bring it back between your needles before you do your brioche purl. Slip one yarn over, brioche purl, and I end with my knit one. So that is the end of row 6, which would complete my next 2 passes, correct? So I'm beginning to actually start to see some actual brioche happening there. Both of my yarns are down here at one end, so I know it's time to turn again. So I will turn, and I am on row 7. Now row 7 is just like row 3. So we already know how to do row 7, but the pattern is written so that way it doesn't say, you know, repeat row 3 and 4. It actually has a row 7. So I'm going to show you how to do row 7 just so you are fully aware how to do it once again. I want to make sure this strings are not underneath me so you can better see how the stitches are worked. All right, you ready? Row 7, we're using color A again. So we will go ahead and knit our first stitch. And if we're reading our knitting, we're looking at our solitary stitch there. So we know we're automatically with our slip one yarn over. And we're looking at the next stitch, which is our brioche, right? And we're looking at purls. So we know it's a brioche purl, right? A brioche purl. So I bring my yarn between my needles and I do my brioche purl. Slip one yarn over, 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 brioche purl. And I end with my knit one. Our last row here is row 8. We slide our stitches down once again so that we can get to color B. B for body, remember? And so I'm down here with my color B, and we will move on to row 8. And we start off with our knit one. And even without looking at the pattern, I know right here I'm looking at a brioche stitch because I can see my yarn over and my slip stitch right there. And I'm looking at knits, so it's a clue I'm on a brioche knit. So I know automatically here I'm going to do my brioche knit, which is a knit 2 together as written in the pattern. Bring my yarn forward, slip one and yarn over, right? And then brioche knit. Slip one yarn over, brioche knit. Slip one yarn over, brioche knit. Pretty easy, right? Once you get going, it has a really good rhythm, and honestly, just give yourself a little bit of time and patience. You will get this. You want to make sure that you don't want to accidentally drop a stitch or anything like that, because fixing mistakes in this is a little bit tricky, and I honestly, that's a whole nother video. So right here, you want to make sure that you just take your time and just keep consistent with the stitches. You've now worked through the setup row through row 8, and the rest of the instructions have you continue on repeating row 5 through 8 until this section measures 6 inches. And based on the row gauge, that will be a total of 48 individual rows. Again, if you download the line-by-line instructions, you can just tick off each line as you finish it, and you will be right where everything is as long as you're getting the same gauge as the pattern. I want to go ahead, I'm going to set this aside. I want to show you one I've been working on here. because I think it really shows you a little bit more. Here is where I can show you that you can use a stitch marker to really help you remember that that first stitch and the last stitch are knits, and then this is actually the full 32 stitches across. And you can see here my color A was my white, I cast on with my white, and my color B was my gray. And as you begin to work along, what you will notice is the whites tend to stack up on each other in a column, and then on the opposite side my grays stack up together in a column. Once you finish the 6 inches of the 2-color brioche ribbing, it's time for the body. And it is really easy. Brioche in the body is going to be a piece of cake. So go ahead, finish your ribbing, and join me back here on the Marley Bird YouTube channel for part 2 of the fantastic brioche scarf. Have fun, guys!